Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The Arizona sky hung low, gray and quiet, as dusk gave way to the kind of night that made men double-lock their doors. Far off in the distance, the last traces of daylight bled into the hills, casting long shadows over the edge of Elias Ward's forgotten land. His small ranch sat silent, just a single lantern flickering in the barn and a tired old horse shifting weight in its stall. Elias had been splitting kindling behind the cabin when he first heard it. Something like a dry branch breaking, then the faint sound of movement, heavy and uneven. He stopped mid-swing, his breath tight. He didn't speak, didn't call out. No neighbors close enough to invite trouble. No sheriff asking him to help in town fights. No ranchers looking for an extra hand. He tended a small herd, kept his tools sharp, and stayed to himself. Tonight, he walked along the narrow stretch of creek that cut past the back of his property. The winter had not yet fully settled, but the air already carried a cold bite. Elias moved with steady caution, scanning for tracks or broken branches. He had learned to trust the land. It always showed signs when something was wrong. He found the sign sooner than he expected. A piece of torn deerskin clung to a low branch, wet and stained. He stopped, studied it, and felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't from an animal. Elias lowered the rifle, but didn't rush. He approached with slow, measured steps, eyes locked on her back to check for movement. His instincts told him she was still alive. Her back rose just enough to catch the breath. He crouched down beside her. "Hey," he said quietly. No answer. "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. He glanced over his shoulder. The barn was closer than the cabin. He made the call. With both arms, he lifted her. She was warm with fever and lighter than she should have been. She tensed slightly as he picked her up, just enough to show she was conscious, but too weak to fight. Elias adjusted his grip and carried her inside the barn, into the tack room where it was dry, warmer, and out of view. He laid her on an old blanket, pulled a water canteen from the hook, and set it beside her. Then he built a small fire in the steel barrel he kept for cold nights and lit a single lantern. The light spilled gently across the woman's face, sharp cheekbones, dark smudges under her eyes, and a long cut along her temple that had dried into a dirty scab. She looked young, maybe 25, maybe less, but something about her made him think she'd lived far more than that. He kept his voice low. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to touch you." She stirred but didn't open her eyes. Her lips moved like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Elias Ward, 37, had been living alone on this land for nearly 6 years. He wasn't born in Arizona. He came from the Mississippi hills, the son of a blacksmith, once married, once a father. All of that ended in a wagon ambush that left him under a dead mule with a broken leg and 2 fresh graves to dig. After that, he drifted, fought as a scout in skirmishes that weren't officially wars, worked freight lines, slept rough, and eventually bought this land with cash and silence. He didn't write letters, didn't want to be found. He didn't bring people back to the ranch, ever. Yet here he was, kneeling beside a woman who didn't say her name, didn't explain a damn thing, and didn't need to. She looked like she had nowhere else to go. He touched the back of his hand to her cheek. "Huh." He pulled off his coat, laid it over her, and sat back against the wall. The rifle leaned beside him, close but not in his hands. He stared at the fire. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Every now and then, she twitched, fingers curling slightly, head turning away from the light. He could guess the kind of dream she was having. He'd had them himself for years. A few hours passed. The night deepened. She woke with a sharp breath and lurched upright, gasping, one arm shielding her chest, the other reaching instinctively for a weapon she didn't have. Her eyes locked on Elias, wide, scared, and full of questions. He didn't move. "You're in my barn," he said evenly. "You passed out. I brought you in." She didn't speak. "There's water. You're hurt. You can rest here till you can walk again." Still no answer, but she didn't try to run. He watched her for a moment, then stood slowly and stepped toward the door. "I'll be outside." She blinked, tracking him as he left. Once the door closed behind him, she sat back, knees pulled up to her chest, and listened to his footsteps fade into the dust. He returned an hour later with a clean bandage, a tin of beans, and a look that said he wasn't asking for gratitude. She didn't speak, but she let him clean her wound. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't flinch when he dabbed at the dried blood. Not once. He didn't press her for her name, her story, or why she'd been running barefoot across the desert. That could wait. The mission, for now, was simple. Keep her alive. Let her decide what comes next. And figure out, quietly, what the hell just walked into his life. The morning crept into the barn without warmth, its pale light slipping through the gaps in the wooden walls and settling gently across the blankets where the Apache woman rested. Elias stepped inside with quiet boots, carrying a pot of warm water and a cloth. He had slept badly. Every time he closed his eyes, he half expected to hear her collapse again or wake screaming. But she hadn't. She stayed silent, curled beneath his coat, breathing slow and steady. When he approached, she opened her eyes instantly, alert, guarded, the same way a hunted person wakes. She pushed herself upright with a stiffness that made her wince. Elias paused a few steps away, giving her time to adjust, giving her the space she seemed to need. "You've got a fever," he said plainly. "I can help with that if you'll let me." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased a fraction. That was enough. He knelt and set the pot beside her, soaking the cloth and wringing it out. As he reached for her forehead, she tensed. Elias froze, waiting. Slowly, she lowered her chin, allowing it. He pressed the cloth lightly to her skin, cooling the heat that clung there. Her breathing steadied. After a moment, she whispered her name. "Ayoka." Elias nodded once. Elias Ward. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, as if saying her name had cost her more than it should have. She held the blanket close to her shoulders, watching every motion he made, measuring him. Elias could see the exhaustion beneath her caution, the way her fingers trembled, the way the sweat on her skin caught the light, the way she leaned back against the wall only after she was sure he wouldn't reach for her. He kept his voice steady. "You were alone out there, barefoot, clothes torn, someone chasing you." Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted her leg slightly, exposing a deep bruise along her calf, the kind only a hard fall or rough hands could make. Elias didn't push for details. Pressing her now would only make her retreat further. Still, he needed to know enough to keep trouble off his land. "If someone's looking for you, I need to be ready." Ayoka lowered her gaze. Her voice came thin, almost rasped. "I was sent away. By her people." She nodded once, forcing the word out. "Exiled." Elias absorbed that quietly. He understood the weight of a home lost. What he didn't understand, yet, was why she had been sent out alone, injured, and pursued. But she wasn't ready to share that. He could see in the way she held her breath between sentences, as though every memory tightened something inside her chest. He stood and stepped back to give her space. "You can stay here until you can move. I won't ask anything more than that." Her eyes lifted to him again, searching for something. False kindness, hidden motives, a price. She found none. Elias wasn't a man who played roles. He didn't know how. Ayoka's voice shook slightly. "Why help me?" That was the question listeners from Chapter 1 might have wondered as well. Why a man who kept to himself, who didn't trust easily, would carry an Apache woman into his barn without hesitation. Elias answered honestly. "You look like someone who needed help," he said, "and I've seen too many people die alone." The honesty softened something in her expression, even if only for a moment. He turned to leave, giving her room to breathe, but she called out, just one word, quiet and strained. "Wait." Elias stopped. Ayoka shifted uneasily on the blanket. "If I stay, no one else comes here?" "No," Elias replied. "Not unless I want them to." She let out a small breath, almost relief. The fear of outsiders was clear now, something Chapter 1 hinted at but didn't explain. Elias understood. Whoever forced her into the desert wasn't just sending her away. They wanted her out of sight. Maybe worse. He spoke again, voice calm. "You're safe. I won't let anyone in without you knowing first." Ayoka nodded, gripping the blanket as if anchoring herself. Elias spent the next hour checking her injuries. He wrapped the deeper cuts with clean cloth and made a paste from dried herbs he kept in a tin. She watched each step carefully, not because she doubted him anymore, but because she seemed unfamiliar with being cared for. Every time he brushed against her skin, even lightly, she stiffened first, then slowly relaxed. When he finished, she whispered, "Thank you." The words sounded like they hadn't been spoken in a long time. He didn't respond with anything sentimental, just gave a slight nod and stood. "You rest. I'll be outside if you need anything." Before he left, she spoke again. "You live alone?" "6 years now." She studied him for a few seconds. "Why?" Elias hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. In Chapter 1, his past was only touched on. Here, he filled the gap without giving too much away too fast. "Because I'm better at being alone than being around people," he said. "And because I've lost enough already." Ayoka didn't push further. She didn't need the details yet. The truth behind his isolation could come later, when trust no longer felt like a risk. Elias stepped outside and closed the barn door gently. Ayoka leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly, trying to understand if this place, this ranch, this man, was a temporary shelter or the first safe ground she'd stood on in years. For now, she stayed. Elias listened from outside, hearing her settle under the blanket, hearing her small sigh of relief, and made a quiet decision he hadn't planned to make. Until she could walk, he would keep watch. Until she trusted him, he wouldn't move his bed back into the house. And until she spoke the rest of her story, he wouldn't ask another question. The fragile truce had begun, and neither of them knew yet how much it would change. The first night, after Ayoka spoke her name, passed in uneasy quiet. Elias settled just outside the tack room, leaning against the barn wall with his hat pulled low, his rifle beside him, and a blanket draped loosely across his legs. He tried to rest, but every half hour he found himself listening for her breathing, checking for movement, waiting for the sound of distress. He told himself he was only being cautious. After all, someone exiled to her condition might have enemies close behind, but the truth was simpler. He didn't want her to panic alone. Inside, Ayoka lay awake far longer than she let on. She stared at the barn rafters, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The warmth of the fire and the quiet around her should have eased her mind, but her body stayed rigid with the familiar sense that rest was dangerous. Her exile was still fresh, and the memory of being driven out. Accusations she never had the chance to answer, hands pushing her away from the fire circle, the threat in their eyes, would not leave her. She kept listening for footsteps from outside, certain someone would come looking for her. The first question listeners might have wondered from the earlier chapters was why she was so terrified of sleep, why she reached for Elias at night. Chapter 3 begins to answer that. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. And then, sometime after midnight, Ayoka jerked upright with a sharp gasp, breath shaking, hands trembling violently. The nightmare left her disoriented. Shadows looked like figures. The sound of the horse shifting in its stall sounded like pursuit. She pressed a hand against her chest, struggling to steady her breathing. Elias was at the door to the tack room before she could call out. His boot stopped just short of crossing the threshold. "You all right?" he asked, voice low, steady. Ayoka tried to answer, but her throat tightened. She shut her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, but it only made the panic worse. Her hands shook hard enough that the blanket slipped from her shoulders. Elias stepped inside, slow and careful, making sure she saw every movement. "I'm not going to touch you unless you say so." She swallowed, eyes darting to him. Her voice came out small, broken. "Stay." He didn't hesitate. He lowered himself to the ground beside the blanket, sitting close enough for her to feel someone near, far enough that she could move away if she needed. He didn't reach for her, didn't put his arm around her. He simply sat, letting his steady presence fill the space. Ayoka leaned toward him on her own, inch by inch, until her shoulder brushed his. She clung to his sleeve, her breath gradually slowing. She didn't explain the nightmare, and Elias didn't ask. The explanation would come later, when she could speak without shaking. When she finally fell asleep again, her head rested against his arm. Elias stayed awake, staring at the fire, thinking about the last time someone had leaned on him for comfort. It had been years, too many to count. By the second night, the pattern had become clear. Ayoka fell asleep quickly. Exhaustion did that, but woke in a panic several times, each time calling his name softly, barely above a whisper. She didn't ask for anything else, just his presence. She needed to know someone else was awake, watching the dark for her, making sure no one dragged her back into the desert. This answered another question listeners might have: why Elias accepted this without complaint. He recognized trauma when he saw it. He knew how losing home, family, and safety could tear a person apart inside. And he saw that Ayoka wasn't clinging out of desire. She was clinging because she had lost every part of her world at once. Each time she woke, Elias moved to her side. Sometimes she gripped his wrist. Sometimes she held onto the edge of his coat. Sometimes she didn't touch him at all, just watched him, trembling, until the panic passed. Elias began to feel the weight of it. His eyes grew rimmed with fatigue, his movements slower during the day. His horse noticed it first. Elias's usual firm, steady grooming became sluggish. He found himself staring at the fence line for long stretches, trying to chase away the tired fog in his mind. Ayoka saw it too. She studied him whenever she thought he wasn't looking, guilt flickering behind her guarded expression. But she couldn't stop her body from reacting the way it did. The moment darkness fell, her breath shortened, her muscles tightened, and sleep became a battlefield she could not win alone. On the third night, the worst panic hit. Ayoka woke with a strangled cry, hands clawing at the blanket, chest heaving. Elias moved instantly, kneeling beside her. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and didn't let go. Her entire body shook, as if she expected someone to drag her away the moment she blinked. Elias spoke softly, the way one would calm a frightened animal. Not gentle in tone, but steady and sure. "You're safe. Look around. No one's here. Just me." Her eyes darted wildly before finally locking on his. Something in his calm expression broke through the panic. She started breathing again, shallow but controlled. Her grip loosened, and she lowered her forehead to his shoulder, not out of affection, but because she couldn't hold herself upright. Elias didn't wrap his arms around her. He didn't pull her close. He simply held steady, allowing her to use him as support until her body stopped shaking. It took a long time. By morning, both of them were worn thin. Elias's eyes were bloodshot. Ayoka's legs shook when she tried to stand. Their unspoken reliance on one another had grown stronger than either expected. But Chapter 3 needed to address something else listeners might question: why Elias keeps helping despite exhaustion, and whether Ayoka trusts him fully yet. As Elias prepared to fetch water, Ayoka finally spoke without being asked. "I'm not used to kindness," she said quietly. "I don't know how to accept it without fear." Elias paused, understanding the truth behind her restless nights. "You don't need to be used to it," he replied. "You just need to stay alive." She looked at him for a long time, long enough to show that the strange, fragile bond between them was no longer a misunderstanding or accidental comfort. It was becoming something real, something chosen in silence. But neither of them said it out loud. Not yet. The nights would continue. The need for safety would continue. And so would the slow, careful unraveling of their guarded lives. The third night left Elias running on little more than instinct. By the fourth morning, the strain showed in every part of him. His shoulders sagged, his eyes were red from broken sleep, and a stiffness in his movements made even simple tasks slow and clumsy. When he stepped out of the barn at dawn, the cold air hit him harder than usual, carrying a faint pressure in his chest that told him he was pushing past his limit. Ayoka watched him quietly from where she sat wrapped in the blanket. She kept her gaze lowered most of the time, but she didn't miss much. Not his unsteady steps, not the way he rubbed his temples, not the rare moment when he pressed a hand to his lower back from sleeping on the hard floor. She held her knees close and said nothing, unsure how to speak the guilt growing inside her. She hadn't meant to depend on him this much, but fear had its own laws, and sleep had become a dangerous place she couldn't enter alone. Elias didn't blame her, but the exhaustion worked its way into his mind. He found himself losing focus when chopping wood, nearly slicing into his hand. He had to stop and breathe, shaking his head to clear the dizziness. He wasn't the kind of man to complain, but he could no longer ignore the toll of waking to her panicked gasps night after night. The chapter needed to address a question listeners might have had from earlier. Why doesn't Elias ask for space? Why doesn't he tell her to stop waking him? The answer began to take shape here. Inside the barn, Ayoka tried to stand but struggled to keep her balance. She braced her hand against the wall, breathing through the pain in her ankle. Elias stepped toward her instinctively, but she raised her hand, signaling she wanted to manage on her own. She didn't want to add more weight to the growing strain she saw in him. "You're not ready to walk far," Elias said. "I can try," she replied softly. "I'm stronger today." Her voice carried both determination and apology. Elias didn't argue. She needed to feel control again. He nodded and stepped back. Ayoka tested her leg with careful steps